Good afternoon, everybody. Thomas Paine, at our nation's founding in Common Sense, wrote, "In America, the law is king." We are all in the middle of a great national experiment to find out whether that is still true. And that's what we're going to discuss today. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We have gathered some of our leading experts from our secure, undisclosed locations to talk about the new administration, its attacks on the rule of law, what they mean, what's new, what's not new, and what will happen and what can be done about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, a few housekeeping matters. First of all, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. We work, as we see it, to strengthen, reform, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in this country so they work for everybody. We do not support or oppose any candidates for office or any political parties. We will vigorously debate the issues facing our country, and that's what we're doing today. Civility is important to all of us. And if you post rude or intemperate comments or language in the message streams on Facebook or YouTube, you will be removed from the conversation. And live closed captioning will be provided. Again, thank you for joining us. In the chaos and clamor of the first month of this Trump administration, it can really be hard for all of us to kind of draw a common theme. There's so much every hour, every day. It can be hard to tell sometimes if this is a concerted, planned effort to undo a century's worth of government or just a bunch of people running around pushing buttons saying, what would this one do? What would this one do? We see this domestically. We see it internationally, where the United States today sided with Russia at the United Nations to oppose a resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine. There's a lot to take in. But when it comes to domestic matters, the matters that affect most of us the most, there is one thread that runs through all of it. It's a willingness over and over to break the law. The willingness this new president and this new administration have shown, not just to push boundaries, not just to question norms, but to break the law. Now, sometimes these laws are explicit statutes. Arguably, we will hear about the Impoundment Act governing how money is spent that's supposed to be spent, that Congress sets aside. Sometimes that breaking of the law goes deeper to the Constitution itself. Sometimes it's a good way to understand some of the assaults on the agencies of government, the change in the role of the Justice Department and the FBI that we've seen just in the last few days, and more. And we at the Brennan Center for Justice focus, of course, on the law and on the rule of law and how it affects not just our system, but all the people in our country. We're very lucky to be able to have with us some of our leading experts to help sort through and to share with you some of the conversations we have in the halls on Slack among ourselves, trying to sort through what's going on. I want to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'll start with some questions and give them a chance to kind of chew on this together. We'll hear, first of all, from Barton Gellman. Bart is perhaps known to many of you. He is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He came to the Brennan Center from The Atlantic. He's senior advisor at the Brennan Center. And among other things, led exercises last year to try to map out what might happen should an authoritarian president take office. We will hear from Liza Goitein. She is the senior director of our Liberty and National Security program and one of the country's leading experts on the laws used by presidents that confer vast power on those presidents that could be abused, and has written about that a lot and is preparing to respond to what is going on and what may be going on. We will hear from Dan Weiner. Dan leads our elections and government program. He is a former attorney at the Federal Election Commission and is one of the country's leading experts on the outsized role and now the gargantuan role of big money in American politics. And we will hear as well from Sean Morales Doyle, who leads our voting rights team, is one of the country's leading voting rights litigators and attorneys, and can talk to us about some of the other through lines that link so many of these activities. Thank you to all of my colleagues. And Bart, with your grasp of history and your experience covering as a journalist other administrations, other presidents, what is new? What is different about this administration?
Well, that's a really important question. To explain what's new, I think it would be helpful to compare this president and this administration to what was previously the most aggressive administration in asserting its ability to define what the law is, and that was Bush-Cheney in the 2000s. They maintained, and up to a point, they had a plausible argument that because the Constitution vests the executive authority in the president, every other official in the executive branch was in some sense subordinate to his authority. They did not, however, refuse to acknowledge that Congress had the power to write laws that governed the executive branch, and that it had the power to create independent and explicitly bipartisan panels like the Federal Election Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, whose members and decisions were not controlled by the president. That is, they did not claim that there was no such thing as a president breaking the law. They took care to follow the forms of law. When they did even repugnant things such as torture, they made sure to get the relevant office in the Justice Department to issue opinions that something like that was lawful. Now, these were terrible opinions, and they were later repudiated, but they accepted the premise that the president was bound by law. Now, this president, Trump, has literally declared himself a king. He has said, "He who saves his country does not violate the law," as if he himself can define by his own words and deeds what the law is. So here's a short list of some examples. Trump and his lieutenants are firing prosecutors who upheld the law and did their jobs honorably. They're firing prosecutors who refused to use the law for extortion. They're firing the JAGs, who are the top legal officers of the military services. And they're doing that because, as the Secretary of Defense just said on television, he doesn't want, quote, roadblocks to anything the president wants to do. They're firing inspectors general. Those are the ethics watchdogs whose whole job is to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse. They're firing the FBI director, the deputy director, replacing them with political loyalists who literally made their names with lies and fabrications. They're firing FBI agents and other federal law enforcement officers. They're firing federal regulators. They're firing privacy officers. They're firing the head of the Merit System Protection Board, which you might never have heard of, but that's the office that defends federal workers against exactly this kind of arbitrary dismissal. None of this is normal. Some of it is itself illegal. None of it has ever happened before. And there's only one reason to fire lawyers and watchdogs, and that's to make it easier to break the law. It's proof of premeditation. It's a confession in advance of illegal intent. Now, these are early days. We're 1 month in. Trump and his people are just getting started. We'll talk today about what can be done, but that's the threat we're here to discuss.
And you're right. It's important to both to look at the form of the law, but also the way it's enforced. And one of the things that will be a constant refrain, and it's, again, in the deluge of news, it's important for us to all remember so much of what's noteworthy about what Elon Musk and his acolytes are doing through their Doge project is not just destructive or not destructive of the government agencies that they're landing in, but it's important to remember that very often it is illegal. that it has been found by courts already over and over again to be breaking specific laws, the privacy laws and other things of that nature, or the broader requirement that it is Congress under the Constitution that has the power of the purse. It is Congress with laws passed and signed by presidents that create or turn off government agencies or end government agencies. And the rule of law here is not some kind of arcane or, for that matter, abstract thing. It's very much part of how power works in the country. Liza Goitein, building off of what Bart just said, you have especially studied the statutes that potentially give presidents vast and unchecked power. Some of these go back to the 1700s and the 1800s. Not all of these have been used yet. Some of what Bart described just ignores the statutes altogether. Do you think that they have moved beyond using statutes that are potentially abusive to not caring about the law, or should we be expecting the next shoe to drop with those relating especially to domestic military deployment?
Yeah, I would absolutely expect the next shoe to drop. I think, as Bart has pointed out, there are all kinds of instances in which it doesn't seem to matter what the law says. So in some ways, why bother to cite legal authorities? But I do think this is a both and situation, and that we're likely to see invocations of the Insurrection Act, an invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. These are laws that the president has name checked throughout his campaign, that he seems eager to invoke. There are questions certainly about why he hasn't invoked them yet. But in his day one orders, he actually teed up an invocation of both of these laws. And so just to quickly review, the Insurrection Act gives the president the authority to deploy federal forces domestically to quell civil unrest and to execute the law in a crisis. And the Alien Enemies Act confers very broad detention and deportation powers on the president during wartime. So these are authorities that he has mentioned many, many times. And in his day one executive order, his emergency proclamation at the southern border, he directed the Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security to submit a report within 90 days that would include a recommendation whether to invoke the Insurrection Act. And he similarly teed up a potential invocation of the Alien Enemies Act in another order. So if I had to guess, I think he's looking for a little bit of a fig leaf of legitimacy in the form of sort of actions by his cabinet to tee up an invocation of these laws. In the past, in 2020, when he toyed with the idea of invoking the Insurrection Act during the protests over the police killing of George Floyd, the then acting Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, publicly said that this was not an appropriate occasion for using the Insurrection Act, and that sort of cut him off at the knees. So I think he's possibly just trying to reverse that dynamic this time around. But in the meantime, he's doing plenty without invoking those authorities. And primarily, he's relied on this notion of an invasion at the southern border as a justification for suspending legal protections that migrants have, including the legal right to seek asylum. He's also used this notion of an invasion to direct NORTHCOM, which is the combatant command for the North American continent, to draw up plans for a military campaign at the southern border. And needless to say, or at least it should be needless to say, that this is a massive abuse of power that has no basis in the law. There are statutes, there are provisions of the Constitution that apply during invasions, but those all relate to armed attacks by foreign countries or foreign powers or other political entities, not people coming across the border without documentation. And even if we were in the middle of an invasion, that would not, under our Constitution, give the president the right to pick and choose which laws Congress has passed that he's going to follow.
It's worth noting because these laws may not be so familiar, the ones that Liza has just described. These have barely been used in American history. The Insurrection Act dates from 1804, and the Alien Enemies Act is the last remaining part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the notorious laws that cracked down on dissent in the country's first years, from 1798, and they dated from what Thomas Jefferson at the time decried as a reign of witches. Some of you may be like me and have not really thought about those laws very much since high school history. The Alien Enemies Act, which Trump name-checked in his inaugural address, has only been used 3 times. The most recently during World War II to intern Japanese nationals and German and Italian nationals as well. And it can only be used when we're actually at declared war with a government.
Or a proclaimed invasion, but it has to be an invasion by a foreign government or nation, and that's critical.
And so the use of the word invasion is not just rhetoric or hype. It's got a legal dimension to it. When you hear it, it's not just noise from the Oval Office. Before we turn to Dan Weiner and Sean Morales Doyle, Bart, I want to go back to you with a question. You have written about other presidents. You wrote an acclaimed book on Vice President Dick Cheney. There are other presidents too who, at the time, folks said, "Oh, they're really trampling on the law." You've said, well, they gave tribute, at least to hypocritically, if nothing else, to the form of the law. But there were a lot of the arguments about the unitary executive and other things that we have heard in other administrations. How can we sort out what's new and what's not new, or is that the wrong question?
Well, I think it's the right question. Other administrations made very aggressive legal arguments and tried to redefine words or stretch the definition of words. But what they were doing was they were accepting the premise that they were bound by what the law says. And they were accepting the premise that courts decide what the law says. So now you have a vice president in J.D. Vance who said before the inauguration day that if courts try to stop Trump from doing what he wants to do, he should respond the way Andrew Jackson did when the Supreme Court ruled against him and say, Mr. Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Besides the fact that Jackson never actually said that, he was explicitly saying that Trump should disobey a high court ruling. More recently, he has said judges are not allowed to interfere with the legitimate powers of the president. And you could interpret that to be correct. The question is, who decides what are the legitimate powers of the president? And in our country, that's the courts.
So, and in the Democracy Futures Project exercises that Bart ran with others, which involved dozens of former cabinet secretaries, governors, generals, and others, really mapping out how the system would and wouldn't respond to authoritarianism emanating from the White House. One thing that was not actually envisioned was the world's wealthiest man paying for the campaign of the winning candidate, running much of the campaign of the winning candidate, moving into the White House and then in office, and then being let loose on the federal government from the inside without ever being nominated for a cabinet position or anything else. That is, of all the things we're trying to wrap our minds around, the newest. It's not unheard of for wealthy individuals to be given a blue ribbon commission to look for government waste. There's certainly a lot of government waste, but this is something obviously far, far beyond what has happened before. Dan, you have written, I think, a really powerful article with our colleague Larry Norton in Time Magazine about what's different about this in the long history of money in American politics. It's not like it's a new thing that money matters in American politics, but there's something very different about this. What is different what's the implication for the campaign finance system? What's the implication for how we understand corruption in our government?
Well, thank you for that, Michael. I think that it is both a continuation of what we've seen before, but then we are in a very different moment. So, as you noted, money in American politics, not something new, particularly after the Citizens United decision, which was 15 years ago, right? We've seen the uber wealthy play an increasingly prominent role in our campaigns, mostly using super PACs. This was, in 2024, a bit of a breakthrough election for that, because you had the winning presidential campaign that raised almost half of its money through super PACs, and which essentially became an arm of the campaign. That was President Trump's campaign. And of course, you had the largest donor, Elon Musk, who gave almost $300 million, really mobilize and become essentially a surrogate of the campaign. And none of that would have been legal prior to Citizens United. But then what's different right now? And so this sort of links to what Bart and Liza were talking about, is we're in this moment of super PAC dominance. We also have a presidency, right, that is unconstrained relative to what we have seen before, both in terms of actual legal safeguards against the presidency, which are weaker than ever before. And then as Bart and Liza have been discussing, perhaps an unwillingness to abide by even the safeguards that do exist, right? And so you combine that with also a president who has taken, I think, a uniquely transactional approach to the role, who campaigned openly about promises to reward friends and punish enemies, and combine that with the kind of oligarchic system that we have in our campaigns. It's a very, very, very alarming and new combination. And then, of course, the third impact here is that we're not just talking about any oligarchs. We're talking about the lords of the attention economy, big tech. Those were who were lined up behind the president at his inauguration. It wasn't the CEO of General Motors or General Electric. It was the major social media platforms. And that, too, of course, shapes our debates and shapes our reality. If you look, for instance, at the dismemberment of USAID, right, which the illegal dismemberment of USAID, that seems to be largely driven by conspiracy theories that are simply not based in reality, but that are flying around on social media on the very platforms that Elon Musk owns. So it is really a very new system. And I think that that is driving some of, again, what Bart and Liza talked about, which is this kind of alternative reality that is developing, under which longstanding legal doctrines that none of us would ever have disputed were valid are suddenly being called into question based basically on conspiracy theories online.
I've mentioned a few times the way in which Musk's role challenges checks and balances, and Congress's core role under the Constitution. Again, some of this is specific laws, and it would be worth explaining what the Impoundment Act is for those who don't know. And some of this goes to the basic structure of the economy. But what is special about what is and isn't being done? What is the basis of so many of the dozens now of court rulings blocking or temporarily, at least, this law-breaking spree? What should people know about the Impoundment Act, and why are they going to learn more about it than they ever thought they would need to in the coming months? Dan?
Oh, I'll go ahead. Well, the basic principle of it's the Anti-Impoundment Act, right? Which is
that one too.
Before Nixon, President Nixon came into office, right? There was no statutory requirement that presidents spend the money that Congress appropriated. Remember, we have this thing called checks and balances in three branches of government. Congress holds the power of the purse. It decides what the priorities are, and then the president faithfully executes the priorities Congress has identified. What President Nixon wanted to do, and some of his predecessors before him, is he wanted to say, well, actually, I don't agree with those priorities, so I'm going to impound the money, and I'm going to keep it. And I'm not going to spend it on the priorities you Congress has identified. Congress in the way our founders envisioned, said that's not a great idea. We don't agree with that. They passed the Anti-Impoundment Act, and I'm oversimplifying here, but it requires the president to spend the money that Congress has appropriated according to the priorities Congress has identified. What is happening now is essentially, and the Supreme Court has never struck down the Anti-Impoundment Act. It is good law. It is the governing law. What the Trump administration came into office to do was to essentially say, oh, we think that restriction is unconstitutional, notwithstanding that no one has ever said that. We're just not going to spend the money. And of course, now they are getting, held accountable, at least for the moment, in federal court. What is, I think, interesting, and this gets back to something Bart said, right, and it crosses a lot of different areas, is there is a difference between adopting aggressive legal interpretations and going out and saying, we're really going to set up a test case, and literally just coming out the gate saying, actually, we just don't think the law applies. I mean, it's the same thing that's happening with the dismissals of so many independent agency heads, including, for instance, the chairwoman of the Federal Election Commission. That dismissal was illegal. And another administration might have tried to set up a test case. It might have negotiated to try to come to a resolution. This administration seems to, at the moment, think that they'll just do what it wants to do and dare the courts to stop it. So that is, I think, and my co-panelists could opine on this too, a significant escalation. And obviously, we're seeing that very much in the anti-impoundment space. And that is, of course, the area that has the most impact on people's daily lives, from everything from, forest fire prevention in the West to consumer protections to thousands of programs that all of us depend on.
I want to turn to Sean Morales Doyle and to put a point on what you just said. One of the things that's interesting about Trump is that in many ways he ran to the left of traditional Republicans on economic issues. He always has. In other words, he was not campaigning on cutting big government. Even the tariffs are seen as verging from traditional Republican economics. But a lot of what they've been doing, a lot of what Russell Vought has been doing at OMB, a lot of what Musk has been doing is a hyperactive implementation of massive cuts in government spending. It's almost Paul Ryan's economic program implemented by executive wrecking ball. And they have not chosen to go to Congress to try to get Congress to pass these things, because Congress has repeatedly not passed these things, including when Republicans ran the Congress and had the White House. So it is an end run constitutionally, but it also has a core political consequence. And I actually think some of the increasing frailty of the administration's poll numbers reflect people not actually liking the underlying policies that are being pushed through here. One other through line, and this is for Sean Morales Doyle. One of the actions that Trump took the first day was to sign an executive order purporting to end birthright citizenship. This, as a judge ruled within 3 days, a judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, this was, quote, flagrantly unconstitutional. Birthright citizenship, that you're a citizen if you're born in the United States, is literally in the Constitution. It is in the 14th Amendment. It is one of the reasons they passed the 14th Amendment. This Supreme Court, I would say, will strike it down, as all these other courts have as well. Why would they do that? Part of it is to show that they're willing to break the law, but part of it goes to highlighting what I think is, and I know you have looked at, is a common thread of racial backlash and xenophobia running through a lot of the actions they're taking. And I think that there's a risk that we look at some of these actions, and again, they can look a little bloodless, but these things tie together more broadly, not just in the constitutional forms, but in the underlying problematic motives. Could you talk a little bit about what you see on that, and also on the legislative front, how that's likely to play out in coming weeks? Sean, you're on mute.
I think I'm on mute.
Not in the real world, I hope.
I hope this sounds better. I'm happy to talk about that, Michael. I think it's interesting, following up on what Dan just said and what you just said about how so much of what this administration is doing actually flies in the face of what the American people support, what public polling would suggest people actually want, what people voted for. And in order to accomplish those kinds of things, which are not popular with the American public, and to engage in the kind of power grab that Trump and his allies are attempting to engage in to knock down these various checks and balances and expand the power of the executive, I think there's a need to set out motives for doing that actually do appeal to a broad swath of the American public. And unfortunately, one of the motives that I think this administration has been all too happy to use to justify or serve as an excuse for the kinds of things they're doing is anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and frankly outright racist motives. They have done things like the order ending birthright citizenship, knowing full well that that's not going to hold up in court, with no real intention of having it hold up in court, in order to signal what they stand for. All of the attacks on DEI, all of the the many ways that we are seeing this administration go after immigrants, I think they view that as something that will appeal to a broad swath of the American public, unfortunately. And they can then use that to justify rapid expansions of the executive authority that allow them to accomplish things that I don't think are supported by a broad swath of the American public. And in some ways, what they're doing is in internal conflict. But again, I don't think they care so much about that. So for instance, there's this order ending birthright citizenship, which, as you say, is very plainly written into the 14th Amendment, was one of the main purposes of ratifying the 14th Amendment. But at the same time, Congress is fast tracking a bill called the SAVE Act, which would require people who are registering to vote in federal elections to show either a birth certificate or a passport or some other small set of documents to show that they are a U.S. citizen in order to register to vote. That's problematic for a lot of reasons, but if you actually look at those two policies next to each other, they're very much in conflict with one another, because if we don't have birthright citizenship, then birth certificates are no longer proof that you're a citizen, and so you couldn't really have a policy like that. But the point is to send a message about where this administration, what the motivation is for these kinds of policies. So to shift to talk about the SAVE Act for a minute, this is an act a bill that was introduced last Congress at a time when it had no chance of getting passed, and I don't think a lot of folks were paying too much attention to it, but now has been put on sort of a short list by the Republican leadership in Congress to be a bill that will be fast-tracked through this Congress. And again, what it would do is require that everybody that registers to vote has to show a birth certificate or a passport or something along those lines to prove their citizenship in order to register to vote. And Brennan Center research has demonstrated that actually that will immediately mean that about 21 million Americans don't have the kind of documentation handy that they need to register to vote. A very large percentage of those 21 million people are people that voted in the 2020 election. Our research actually also revealed that fact. And you'd think, well, those folks are already registered, so we don't need to worry about them. But this bill actually requires you to show these documents every single time you register, you re-register. So you move to a new state, you move to a new address, and you need to register again. And so it's going to block all kinds of people who are already registered to vote from participating in elections in the future. All millions and millions, 21 million American citizens from participating in our elections for no reason at all. It will completely destroy forms of registration that people have come to rely upon in this country: online voter registration, mail voter registration, automatic voter registration, because of this requirement that you show up in person to provide documents. And so this would entirely change the rules of our elections. I think is a really important point, given what we've just talked about how so much of the policies that we're seeing this administration pursue are not actually policies that are supported by the American people, but at the same time, they are trying to change the way our democracy functions, make it less representative and responsive to American voters. And it's something people should be really concerned about.
The SAVE Act, it's interesting. Everything we've been talking about up until now has been within the executive branch, and within the interplay between the executive branch sometimes and the courts. The SAVE Act is in Congress, and this goes to one of the questions that we'll have a chance to talk about a lot, which a number of folks have been asking. We're going to turn now to the questions you all have, which is, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? This is a bill that's going to be brought to a vote in the House probably within the next 2 weeks. Then it would go to the Senate if it passes, and it is subject to a filibuster. But given the emotions and everything else, we want to make sure that senators know, for example, that this is a vote suppression bill above all else, despite whatever claims are made for it. You know, as my colleagues know, I among other things, I wrote a book on the history of voting in the United States called The Fight to Vote. And this is not the worst voting bill anybody's ever dreamed up. It is, however, if it were to become law, the worst voting bill ever passed by Congress. The role of the federal government, the role of Congress, it has been throughout the country's history to expand voting rights, often over the objections of recalcitrant states. This would be the first time, as Sean described, that the federal government, through Congress, had pulled back on voting in a meaningful way. And to underscore, it would really rip up the way we register voters in the United States. No more online registration, no more registration by mail, no more voter registration drives, and so forth. So it's the next thing coming, is when the action turns to Congress, and that's going to happen, of course, on the budget as well, with the coming fight over the debt ceiling and the reconciliation bill. Congress and members of Congress actually listen, or at least they have no choice but to hear. They may not listen from voters. And we are starting to see town halls and other ways that the phones are starting to ring off the hook on a number of these issues on Capitol Hill. Let me go to a few of the questions there. We have a few themes that come through a lot. One is, will the court stop this? How would the court stop this? Can we trust this Supreme Court? And what happens if the courts say no, but this administration follows through on J.D. Vance's tweets, if nothing else, and says we're not going to listen to a court order? How will this play out? What can we expect? And what power does Congress have? What power do the courts have to enforce their will? I'll start with you, Liza.
Yeah, it's a great question, a great set of questions. I do think that the courts, and I think we're talking about the Supreme Court here, will shut down a lot of this, probably not all of it, in the area of independent agencies within the executive branch and independent inspectors general. I'm afraid we probably can't rely on this Supreme Court to offer a lot of support. However, there are certain actions that the administration has taken, including, I would say, impoundment of funds, as well as some of the actions with respect to immigration, birthright citizenship, that the court absolutely, I think, will find to be unlawful, because they are so clearly unlawful, even under sort of the broad theories of unitary executive power that have been put forward in the past. And so I think the operative question is really going to be whether the administration will comply with those orders. And as we've discussed, there have certainly been indications that they're not, that they at least want to assert the right to ignore court orders. And one of the indications, I would say, as of now, the administration is claiming that it is following court orders. I think Attorney General Bondi said, for now, we are obeying court orders, but it's not clear that that's true, because we've seen papers that have been filed in court in some of the cases where there have been temporary restraining orders on the government's actions. For example, in a case where the judge said that certain federal funds had to be unfrozen. And the plaintiffs came in and said, those funds are still frozen. They're still not flowing. So I arguably, we are already seeing a sort of quiet non-compliance with court orders, and that is still playing out in the courts. And at some point, if Trump wants to assume the powers of a king, he's going to have to sideline not only Congress, but the courts as well. Now, the courts do have tools at their disposal. There are contempt actions that the courts can pursue, both civil contempt and criminal contempt, both of which can include fines and even imprisonment for government officials. Civil contempt is a way to sort of induce compliance with an order, whereas criminal contempt is to punish officials for past noncompliance. In either case, unfortunately, effectuating these sanctions does rely to some degree on federal law enforcement helping with enforcing these contempt orders. And so whether it's U.S. Marshals or for criminal contempt, maybe federal prosecutors, the next concern is, of course, whether these federal officials will cooperate with the courts in enforcing contempt orders. But in extreme cases in the past, courts have appointed private attorneys to serve as prosecutors in criminal contempt cases. So there are tools at the court's disposal. But the second we are in that showdown, I was going to say we're in a constitutional crisis at that point. I think we're already in a constitutional crisis, but that would really be an inflection point if and when we got to overt noncompliance with court orders.
So I have a question for Dan Weiner. In a lot of ways, it seems like Elon Musk's role is a political Achilles heel for the administration. There was an Associated Press poll about 3 weeks ago, in other words, before a lot of the craziness really got underway, about this. And of course, the public has complex attitudes. They don't hate all corporations. They admire Amazon as a company. They don't hate all billionaires. They all think they're going to become a billionaire. But the poll question was, do you think it's a good thing that the president is listening so much to these very wealthy individuals? And the share of the response that was very good or somewhat good was 12%. This is before all the recent stuff. That suggests a political mismatch, a political disjunction. So one of the questions is if Musk isn't a government employee and Doge isn't a real government agency, how is it possible for them to cut agency funding, activities, and personnel?
So that's a great question. Musk at this point is actually a government employee. He's a special government employee, and Doge is a government agency or office. So he is, for instance, subject to federal conflict of interest laws, which prohibit a government employee from taking part in a matter in which they have a financial interest. I think, when you get at the question, zooming out a little bit, and this relates a little bit to Liza's answer just now. The question is the balance between, whether we're in a constitutional crisis or not, and then sort of ordinary politics, right? And you're right. Musk, I think, is something of a political Achilles heel. You look at, let's just take one example, the dismemberment of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the illegal dismemberment. This is an agency that is estimated to have returned about $20 billion to consumers who were overcharged for financial fees, bank fees, what have you. Who is behind that dismemberment? Well, Elon Musk wants Twitter to be a payment platform. There are CFPB complaints against Tesla for abusive practices related to its in-house lending arm. Obviously, those are complaints, but the CFPB is a thorn in many people's sides, but not the side of the American public. So again and again, what I think one of the points of leverage in this situation is the Trump administration was elected. They were elected to govern and to pursue their policy agenda. They weren't elected to seize power and do a bunch of unpopular things that the American people, frankly, they didn't campaign on. In this country, and this relates to another big part of our work, states administer elections. The federal government sets guidelines, but the states administer them. So we will have, and I believe we will have elections again. And the key right now with your members of Congress, with your local and state representatives, is to make your voice heard about how you feel about how this administration is governing. Right now, I think Congress is relatively cowed, and I think they're not providing much of a check. But I think you're already seeing, members of Congress going out into the country, getting yelled at town halls, getting lots of calls coming into their offices. I really do think that has a significant impact. And ultimately, Congress is also looking to its own reelection and the political futures of its members. And the way this is not a time, I think, to disengage. This is a time to engage harder and to make your voice heard, because ultimately, I think this administration is still accountable to the American people, and electorally will need to be accountable, as will Congress.
And if I could jump in quickly with a follow-up to my answer about the courts, I talked about the tools that the courts have at their disposal. But as Dan was saying, ultimately, this is going to be a political fight. And more than 80% of Americans say that the president has to obey court orders. So if the president were to disobey a court order, that would be wildly unpopular. In a way, that is a much stronger check than any of the tools that the courts have at their disposal.
I'm going to answer a question 9 that was asked, and then turn finally to a question a lot of people have been asking that goes exactly to this point. One of the questions is, could Trump run for a third term, as he has hinted or said he wants to? No, he can't, not on planet Earth. And I think one of the things we can all do is not just to not anticipatorily obey, as the political scientists will tell us, but not treat as interesting possibilities and intellectual questions things that are simply flatly illegal and flatly unconstitutional. There is no way Donald Trump can run for a third term. He knows it too. And the more we thumbsuck about it and muse over how interesting it is that he might try to do it, the less the clarity, the more the clarity of the Constitution becomes blurred. The question that we have been asked over and over in a variety of ways is, what can we do about all this? What can people listening to us do about all this? I'll ask each of my colleagues to weigh in on that. Does making your voice heard to Congress really make a difference?
Yes. I think sometimes it sounds like cliche to say, go talk to your representatives, whether in Congress or in your state legislature, and tell them what you think. But I can say that they care way more what their voters think than they do what any of us on this Zoom think. And we've already seen in the news some evidence of that with all of the calls that they've been receiving, and what that means to them, this flood of calls about Elon Musk, et cetera. The reality is that legislation like the SAVE Act, last year, the SAVE Act passed out of the House with Democrats voting for it. This is not a bill that went entirely along party lines. And that's really significant when, as you say, Michael, if it passes out of the House this time, it goes to the Senate, where a filibuster is likely the thing that would stop it. That means, Democrats are going to have to vote against that bill if it's going to, if it's not going to become law. They need to hear from people that their voters care about that they support their decision to filibuster a bill like that, and that actually really will matter. They are, I think, reeling a little bit. Many people who were elected in this last election or who lost elections are reeling from what happened in the last election and not sure how to respond. They need to hear from their constituents about that. And as you say, we all need to continue to function as though we are living in a democracy where all of these institutions and these rules matter. So far, the Trump administration has done things that are completely out of bounds from what we've seen in the past. But as we heard from a number of people today, they've tweeted about not obeying court orders, but when they actually show up in court, they say, oh, we are technically obeying your order. We misunderstood your order. They're still functioning as though court orders matter. And we all need to, act as if they need to continue to respect those rules. And it is only if the public continues to stand by our institutions and our rules and, hold people accountable, that people in power will continue to respect those rules. So I think it absolutely matters that people hear from that representatives hear from their constituents.
Bart Gellman, as a journalist around the world, you've covered other countries where democracy has advanced or been in retreat. And we've certainly seen it in retreat in so many places, and public pushbacks as well in places such as, you think about the mass street demonstrations in Israel and Tel Aviv about the arcane matter of changes to the structure of their judiciary. As you think about what you saw as a foreign correspondent or covering the world, what lessons are there about how we can make our voices heard?
Well, it is fundamentally that public tolerance, public acceptance, public opinion matters. Every political leader ultimately trades on that. Trump really cares about his numbers. He's losing popularity now. And what citizens can do is make their voices heard to their representatives. I guarantee you they care about that. They especially care about the numbers of calls and letters that they get. People tend to believe stories that are told in their own social networks. So if you know someone who's been arbitrarily fired and who's, or someone who was supposed to get surgery and it was canceled, or someone who had a long planned trip to a national park, but the park was closed because of Trump's firings, tell that story on social media. If you hear other people who have stories like that, amplify them. After all, a lot of what Trump and Musk are doing is unpopular. And if people make that the conversation, remember how powerful it was when on the other side, they wanted to make the conversation about Benghazi or emails.
The last time there was such a very meaningful effort to cut government spending in this kind of way was probably in the early 1980s. And at that point, the moves to, for example, deem ketchup to be a vegetable in school lunches blew up in a way that you can't always tell. In other words, the stories that Bart describes, the anecdotes, the facts, you never know which one is going to catch on with people, but it can actually be very important. I want to ask each of my colleagues, of our panelists, to share with us a concluding thought, which is, what is one thing you want our audience to walk away with this afternoon? And I will start, Liza Goitein, with you.
Yeah, well, as we've discussed today, in so many ways, what this administration is doing is not only unprecedented, not only breaking norms, but is illegal. We can't normalize it. We can't talk about it in terms of testing the bounds of executive power as if these are some unsettled questions of law and that he's just waiting for the courts or Congress to tell him he's gone too far. He's not waiting for that. He's already gone way past some very clearly established boundaries. And part of not normalizing it is calling your representatives. I agree that's extremely important. As a former Hill staffer, picking up the phone is particularly something that offices pay attention to even more than getting emails or other forms of correspondence. So absolutely do that. Be speaking publicly, whether it's on social media, telling stories, as Bart was saying, writing letters to the editor. Make sure that in one way, pick something you can do every week or every month, depending on your schedule, to be out there publicly saying this is wrong. This is not something we support. This is not something anybody voted for. And this is not legal.
Dan Weiner, what's one thing folks should take away? You're on mute.
Am I unmuted now? I think I'm unmuted now.
You are.
I agree. Liza kind of said what I was going to say, but I'll just add an additional thought, which is follow the money. Ultimately, the question here is, and this is true with every administration, this is not unique, but I think it's uniquely extreme here, is what did the administration promise the American people? And then how is it actually governing? And who does that benefit? Ultimately, with this administration, and they will be judged based on to what degree did they fulfill the promises they made to the public. And right now, in many, many respects, they are not fulfilling the promises they made to the public. They're fulfilling different priorities for people like Elon Musk. And ultimately, again, in ordinary politics, it's holding them accountable for whose interests they are serving while they are in office. And when it comes to the election time, that is ultimately going to determine, whether whoever is elected gets to stay in power.
Sean Morales Doyle. You two are muted. We are 5 years into this, folks. Zoom was, we have no excuse.
I have no excuse. Since I already spoke about people talking to their representatives, I guess I would just, as the head of our voting rights program, reiterate, we do still have elections in this country, and we have another set coming next year. So people need to participate in electoral politics. That means go and vote primarily, but it also means, participating in voter registration drives while they're still legal before the SAVE Act is passed. Making sure that you stay engaged in politics and that you make your voice heard, because it's only through elections that we're going to, it's using these democratic institutions, it's engaging with these democratic institutions that's going to keep our democracy alive and keep them functioning and make sure that they are accountable to all of us. All of these things that we've been talking about today ultimately come down to a power grab, and that power is being taken from somewhere. And it's being grabbed from the American people primarily. And so everyone needs to do what they can to take it back by participating in what still is a democratic system.
Art Gilman.
Well, I want to give credit to everyone who's tuned into this webinar, because my first advice is to tune in, not tune out. Don't step away. Don't be discouraged and say there's nothing you could do. So stay informed, not only from the Brennan Center, but from every source of information that you give credence to, what is happening and what should be happening. If you have the means, contribute to organizations or candidates who stand for the things that you believe in, because unfortunately, money is a very big part of politics these days. And a point I know that Liza has made in the past is that there are a great many civil society organizations that are trying to pick up the slack that's being left by the end of government services and the shutdown of so many government functions. And they need resources to do that. But above all, make your voice heard in all the different ways that you can, because as Sean said, the power that they're trying to usurp in this government is yours.
Thank you. And I would add to all of that, we need to avoid the temptation that headline writers put forward of the president runs the country. Nobody runs the country, but the president doesn't even run the government. Ours is a complex government of many branches. We all need to remember to hold Congress accountable for its role, hold the Democrats accountable, make sure they're awake and doing what they need to do, and hold the Republicans accountable. We need to find a way, hard as it is to imagine in this partisan and polarized time, to get Congress as an institution to do its part, to step up for its role in the constitutional system. We hope the same thing will happen with the courts. This is a big moment in the long history of our country. I hope you can all see that we at the Brennan Center for Justice are fired up. We're in the fight. We know the stakes. We're focusing in on those things that we can be most helpful on, where our expertise is of greatest value to the broader effort to fight for the Constitution, for democracy, for justice, for the rule of law. And we actually have fun doing it. We hope you will continue to stay in touch with us. If you want to learn about our work, especially, please sign up for our newsletters. We now have 360,000 subscribers to our newsletters. They are not spam. They are full wonkery. They are opt-in, and you can keep up with all of our work. The briefing newsletter comes out every Tuesday, and there are others. Our website is brennancenter.org. Thank you for being part of the great American conversation. We, if we do this right, can make this not the end of American democracy, but the beginning of the next chapter in this great fight for the future of our country. Thanks so much.